Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Your Legislators, a production of KRWG Broadcasting. Your Legislators is a public service program providing our viewing audience in southern New Mexico the opportunity to hear about important legislative issues directly from their elected representatives in Santa Fe. Here's your host, Sloan Patton.
Hi, thanks for joining us. Well, as the session begins, we'll be talking about several things coming up. The budget is going to be the main concern in this shorter session, the Rio Grande conservation, as well as things to do with the spaceport. With us today is Joseph Cervantes. He's a senator here in New Mexico. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you today.
Yeah, thanks for coming with us. And so you were telling me that being part of the Judiciary Committee, that you'll be crafting a lot of the bills or a lot of the language when it comes towards the end of the session. But here, as the session begins, what sort of things, looking forward with the budget, will you be tackling?
Well, the key is remembering this is a 30-day session, so the agenda is the budget and then whatever the governor puts on the agenda for her initiatives. And right now, in terms of the budget, the state is doing well in terms of its balancing of the budget based on the revenues we've got, and we do that every year. The legislature is required by Constitution to present the governor with a balanced budget, and we've always done so. You'll hear from time to time people talking about deficits and balancing the budget outside of deficits. That can't happen in New Mexico. So every year the legislature presents a balanced budget, and we'll do so again this year.
When it comes to the spaceport, whether laws are passed or not, let's say that a law is passed that everything that's wanted for the spaceport, the $8 million, I believe it is, goes through. When you're there at the end of the session, what sort of crafting will you have to do with that $8 million to make sure that it goes in the right hands, or just what will the legal language of that look like?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that there's talk of $6 or $8 million for a spaceport southern road. The citizens of Doña Ana County have paid for a large part of the spaceport, but there's no access to southern New Mexico for the spaceport. You have to go up through Truth or Consequences. $6 or $8 million isn't going to get the job done. That's the problem. This is really a Band-Aid. The $6 or $8 million is going to get what's called a chip seal road. It's not going to deal with flood issues. It's going to be a nice dirt road, if you will. And for the spaceport to really succeed, and for southern New Mexico to realize the promise of spaceport, we're going to have a first-class road to southern New Mexico. I think we ought to do that.
Mm-hmm. How hard do you think it's going to be to convince the rest of the Senate, the rest of the House, to vote on something that would increase that to, I'm guessing, 15, maybe 20 million?
Well, the first thing we have to do is get the leadership of the state, the governor on down, to invest themselves into doing a first-class job of this roadway. So if we just want to say we did a road just to say we did one, and if it's a poor road and it's an inferior road that's only going to last a shortened period of time and it's going to require more maintenance, we're just kicking the can down the road. And so we have to commit ourselves to making that happen, and it's going to cost some more money, sure, but the alternative is just to say we did it without really accomplishing anything.
Yeah. If the spaceport is completed and we see maybe 5, 10, or 15 launches off of it, and then something happens to where either Virgin Galactic decides it will keep its lease, but it wants to do its business elsewhere, or other space, I believe SpaceX is another one, they decide that they don't want to be here in southern New Mexico, what would it mean for the economy? What do we do next?
Well, we have to make sure that doesn't happen. I mean, we have to do everything it takes to invest ourselves and the state, really, into this project. My concern to date has been that so much of the investment is coming solely out of Doña Ana County. The citizens here, every time you make a purchase in our county, you're paying for the spaceport, your gross receipts taxes, everything you buy. You go to McDonald's or whatever it may be, you're paying for the spaceport. And it's time for the entire state to get behind this project, not just local Doña Ana County taxpayers. So that will get us the road, that will put the marketing behind the project, that will put the investment into bringing more users than just the isolated few we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Are there any senators that you think you'll be able to convince from either Albuquerque, other parts of the state, that would be willing to pitch in some money for the spaceport?
Well, we're fortunate to have good leadership from here in the southern part of the state in the Senate. So Senator Papin has, of course, been a leader on spaceport. I'm confident that with a good effort from our southern Senate delegation and from our members in the House as well, too, that we'll be able to persuade the rest of the state to get behind this investment. We've put a lot of money into this project already. We need to see it through all the way.
Well, you'll be able to see a story here on KRWG coming up in the next week or so about Rio Grande conservation. We're going to be doing a story down in Santa Teresa, but could you tell me about some of the work that you've done on the Rio Grande conservation?
Well, this last year I've headed and chaired the drought committee of the legislature. And like many people here in southern New Mexico, I've been dismayed by the fact that our river down here had 6 weeks of water out of the year. We had water a little bit of the month of June, I guess, and a little bit of July. When you travel up to Santa Fe as much as I do, you realize the river is full up in Albuquerque. It's full up in northern New Mexico. Yeah. The water's just not getting released down here to the southern part of the state. And of course, that negatively affects waterfowl, fish, our entire ecosystem down here. And of course, it's just a sad thing to see a dry river. So we have to get much better about managing our water, and assuring conservation on the river is a good place to begin.
Well, I know out east of the Mississippi, the laws for most of the rivers there say that people that are north of a river that is flowing south, they have to make sure that enough water is still flowing down to the southern part. But from what I understand, if you're west of the Mississippi, you can cut off water legally at certain points and not be liable for the dry riverbed, so to speak, for down here. Is that something that we deal with? Or?
I would say that New Mexico has very good water laws that assure where water is to be delivered and how it's to be delivered. The problem is that politicians oftentimes don't have the courage to follow those laws, and then oftentimes the people with greater political influence have greater influence in delivery of water. So for example, Albuquerque in the northern part of the state have water in the river. A large part of the reason for that is they're importing water from Colorado. We have the San Juan Chama diversion project, which brings water through a pipeline and puts it in the river. It's kept in there for a number of things, including endangered species protection, which are good things. But too much of the water here is going strictly by us into Texas, and too much of it is being held at the reservoir and not being released down here. So the laws are in place here, they're just not being followed well.
Do you think that we're going to have enough water moving forward in the next 10 or 15 years? Is it going to become more of an issue, or if we put things in place now, will that issue sort of disappear?
It's going to become the issue, I think, for all of New Mexico. The reality is that if you look at any western city, including Los Angeles, San Diego, Denver, you take any one of them, they all import water from other locations where there's an abundance to where there's scarcity. We have scarcity here, and right now the state of Texas is suing New Mexico in the Supreme Court to cut off our groundwater pumping. If that happens, our entire agricultural economy here in southern New Mexico becomes in jeopardy and may collapse. And we may end up with a very different looking Rio Grande Valley without it. We need to provide the leadership to make water a priority, and it hasn't been, although I, working with other senators, have really been trying to make it that priority over the last few years, and I think we're beginning to hear some response to those efforts.
What would happen if Texas were to win that lawsuit?
Probably unimaginable consequences for something like that. If Texas was to cut off the groundwater pumping, there's been no water in the river, so the agricultural economy, our valley, our ecosystem down here has been dependent on groundwater pumping entirely. There's been no water released, or very little water released, a matter of inches, to farmland in the last few years. So if the groundwater pumping was to be cut off, there would be no farming in this valley, and there would be no green belt. There would be none of the orchards that we love. I think our entire valley would change, and with it, all of the businesses and the activities that are associated with the farming operations.
Mm-hmm. Do you get a chance to talk to a lot of the farmers that live in the area?
Well, I am a farmer. And my family's a fourth generation farm family, and so I grew up on our farm. My mom is still in the farmhouse, and so I talk to the farmers every day because I work with them, and they're my family. And then I also, through those contacts, have a great opportunity to visit with farmers throughout the entire valley.
For the day-to-day on a farm, how important is water? What does water make up as part of the day?
Well, water and our ability to deliver water is the only reason we have farming here. The Rio Grande project was constructed about a century ago, a little bit more than a century ago. That project includes Elephant Butte Reservoir, all of the dams and canals that we see throughout our valley. And this year, for the first year in the entire history of that project, there was talk that there would be no water delivered through that project to local farming. In the end, farmers got maybe 3 or 4 inches of water, where they're entitled to receive 4 or 5 feet of water, something in that range. So you get an idea that the water that is promised to farmers down here is not being delivered.
Are there any things that should be put in place to make sure that those promises are kept?
A number of things, but the first thing we have to do is what's called adjudication. We have to get a recognition of what water rights are in the state, who owns them, who owns what quantities. And we don't know those things. The courts have been decades trying to get their handle around this. We have armies of lawyers around the state fighting over these issues. But what we really need is the political courage to say we're going to determine what rights belong to who and what quantities of water are allocated under those rights. In doing that, we can begin the process of conservation. But until we do that, there's very little incentive for conservation. In fact, the incentive is for people to do the opposite, to use water to perfect their water rights.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Real ID law. It's something that's been around for quite a while now, at least in the federal government. It's been mandated, but for people that have a New Mexico driver's license, they can usually get through an airport without a problem right now. But in 2014, the federal government says, at least, that it's going to start cracking down on this Real ID law. And so states that don't meet all the requirements, you'll have a harder time getting through airport security. Your New Mexico license won't be as valuable, say, as other states, because we're one of those states that doesn't meet all of the federal mandates. I believe there are about 30 of them, so we're not alone. But do you see any changes coming up to our driver's license once the federal government puts into effect more of those changes, or says that they will?
Well, we've been hearing about this issue for over a decade now that I've been in the legislature. After September 11 and the tragedies in New York and Washington, the federal government, in a rush to deal with that, enacted the Real ID Act. And that put a lot of federal requirements on what driver's licenses should and shouldn't be, including forcing people to go back to trace their birth records and baptismal records and so forth. It's a very expensive process for the state. The states have been resistant to some of those requirements because of the cost, and the federal government has an unfunded mandate. They've told states to do things, but they haven't provided any of the resources for states to do that. As a result, many of the states have pushed back on the Real ID law, and although there's a new deadline of 2014, if you were to research it, you'd find there was a deadline in 2013, 12, 11. Every year there's a deadline, and every year Congress and the federal government extend that, because I think they realize that their demands on the states are not funded by the federal government to do the research as part of all driver's licenses. But I'm confident in New Mexico we'll do what we need to do to make sure that our driver's licenses are effective for federal purposes.
Well, I have the newspaper here with me, and there's something, that it was the headline recently, about a week and a half ago. I don't know if we can zoom in on this, but the school shooting in Roswell, of course, was a tragedy. But with the short session, do you see this being brought up, even though there are so many budgetary issues to go through? There's so much to do with finance, but do you see this as some kind of a jumping point that New Mexico changes anything with gun laws?
Well, remembering again that in a 30-day session, we can only tackle issues the governor puts on the agenda, and the governor has not responded to the shooting by supporting any sort of changes in our gun laws in the state. So without that leadership from the governor, I don't expect we'll see that in this next 30-day session. We have had in years past a number of bills to try and tighten some of the gun laws in our state, namely the laws that relate to gun show, what's called the gun show loophole. And there's been good support in both chambers for that law. And so we may see that particular piece of legislation come through, but that law And frankly, none of the laws that have been proposed would have changed what we saw in the tragedy in Roswell. And we feel for the families and all of the students who are impacted. I have 3 children who have come through the public schools and are in the public schools now. So as a parent, my reaction to that tragedy is that of a father. But the child involved there was a young child with a shotgun, a common gun in New Mexico households, and none of the laws that have been proposed would have made that more difficult for that tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it seems to mark a bit of a turning point here in New Mexico, because historically we haven't had many things like this happen, and people sometimes look to New Mexico because we have such lax gun laws compared to the rest of the country, and they say, oh well, in places where they have very strict gun laws, they still have school shootings in maybe Colorado or in other places, but New Mexico has some of the laxest, and we've had some of the fewest incidences like this. Moving forward, how do you think the rest of the nation is going to look at New Mexico after this situation?
Well, not in any way to minimize the tragedy of Roswell, but we've had tragedies in this country that are even on a larger scale.
Right.
Sandy Hook Elementary School is an example, and Colorado, Columbine, as you pointed out.
Right.
So these tragedies are occurring in our country. The fact that it is now maybe for the first time in New Mexico brings it closer to home, but we shouldn't have to wait for these problems to appear on our doorstep to recognize that there has to be some need, and it needs to be in terms of mental health care, availability of access to prevent people from mental health issues having access to guns and having a place for them to be recognized and treated. That's one place certainly to begin. But I'm hoping that it doesn't take tragedy for us to simply be responding to bad things, but for us to try and anticipate and be more proactive.
Well, something that's been going on in that same town that's a completely different issue, but it's been going on for several years now, is the horse slaughterhouse that's in Roswell, Valley Meat Company, and there have been some pushes from Albuquerque lawyers to try and stop it from opening, and different maneuvers. What's your opinion on that, and where do you see it going?
New Mexico suffers from a crisis of image, I think, and whether it's issues of immigration, whether it's the fact that our children, our schools have now fallen to the worst in the country. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've gone from near the bottom to the bottom. People are leaving our state. They're not coming into our state. Unlike the rest of the country, we're not coming out of this recession. We have to be establishing a new economy here in New Mexico, but I don't know that the idea of selling marijuana, legalizing it and selling it down at the Pickwick, or slaughtering horses and selling the meat, I don't think these are the solutions to our state economy. I'd like to see New Mexico trying to really reach for clean energy and renewable energy economies. New Mexico for high tech, Los Alamos, White Sands, leading the country in technology. We talked about water research, food production. These are things where I think New Mexico should be trying to be on the forefront and leading the nation. Putting ourselves and putting a lot of focus on driver's licenses and horse slaughtering and legalizing marijuana are small issues. They're diversions, and we should be bigger than that.
How do you think that we change that? How do we do that?
We have to find leaders in our state who are willing to set a vision for New Mexico and make us realize that we can do better than we have been doing. Right now, New Mexicans seem to be accepting of the fact that we're now at the bottom. We've fallen to the bottom. And I think we should not accept that. We should begin to realize that we can do better. We should be looking for leaders who want to recognize we can do better, to set the bar higher, and not just always appeal to the lowest denominator. And that's where we're at right now. Right now, we're at the bottom, and nobody is really giving us a plan and a vision to get beyond that.
What's your vision for New Mexico?
Well, it's that. My vision for New Mexico is that we can keep the beauty of our state, our culture, our heritage, our language, and our unique land of enchantment characteristics, and at the same time embrace Los Alamos, embrace White Sands, embrace New Mexico State University, engineering, technology. Take the investment we put into spaceport. It's a $220, $250 million investment. If we were willing to put that same investment into spaceport, into New Mexico State University as well, into technology, energy programs, New Mexico State University could be at the forefront in the nation for some of these study areas, and I think that's where our vision should be.
Besides the spaceport, what do you see as some of those tangible, company or tangible resource here in southern New Mexico or in other parts of the state that can also make the vision possible that you mentioned?
Well, we're fortunate because we have unique resources around the state. I've given Los Alamos and White Sands a mention, but of course we have Sandia Labs. We have federal installations throughout the state. I disagree with some of the political leaders in the state who decry the fact that we have too much of a federal role in our state. And I think it was a mistake for this administration to go close our offices in Washington and then see the loss of federal jobs that have resulted following that. One of the top states in the country right now for business is Virginia. And part of the reason Virginia is so successful is because it has an enormous federal job influence. And so while it's important to diversify our state and have a good private sector economy, we shouldn't be belittling or rejecting the role of federal and state government in this process. And so I think that we should be looking for even a greater federal investment in our state.
Yeah. As the session gets farther along, do you see some of those arguments, some of those heads butting coming up again, where it's federal against private investment?
Well, that's been the message the last few years. The last few years has been the message from some of our leaders in the state has been to, again, close offices in Washington and to really not embrace the federal presence in our state. And I think that's a mistake. I think that you don't have to have one or the other. You don't have to reject the federal government and its investment and its labs and its technology and its role in our community. We don't have to reject that in order to also be trying to encourage and build our private sector. In fact, they can go hand in hand. And spaceport is probably a good example of that, where you have a state investment in technology. Our hope is that the private sector is going to partner with us and embrace that technology, and together we'll move ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, talking a little bit more about the image of the state, New Mexico recently joined 16 other states as being one that recognizes same-sex marriages. The New Mexico Supreme Court voted right around Christmas to allow those in the state. I remember I was in an airport when I found out the news, and of course as a journalist it sort of irritated me that I wasn't able to be here to cover the event, but I also remember it wasn't widely covered that day, maybe because Utah ended up doing the same thing a day or two afterwards. But do you think that that's something that's going to change the rest of the country's image of New Mexico?
Well, I'm an attorney on top of my other interests, and as an attorney, I've long felt and understood the role of equal protection under our Constitution and the equal protection of rights to all people. And it's not a surprise to me that the courts have recognized that equal protection means the same with regard to the state's role in marriage and the state's recognition of marriage. So it was always, for me, a matter of time before the courts would do what they're doing, whether it's the United States Supreme Court, the New Mexico Supreme Court, and other states. This recently, Utah and other states that are considered to be relatively conservative, that have bans on marriage equity, those are being struck down as unconstitutional, and I think that's right. So I'm glad that New Mexico has put this issue behind us. I'm glad that the state is now recognizing that we're not going to discriminate against people based on issues that in the past the state did discriminate on. And as a lawyer, that makes me pleased to know that the law has played a positive role in recognizing that equity among people.
Do you think that it's something that could draw people from other states to come and live and work here?
Well, I'd like to think so, but the reality is that we see the dominoes falling. I mean, New Mexico is one of the more recent states to come to this recognition, but we see, it seems every month, a new state recognizing marriage equity. And it really seems to me to be just a matter of time before many more states will follow that same lead, and maybe even the United States Supreme Court recognizing that equal rights mean marriage equity as well, too, around the whole country. if all the states have the same recognition of equal rights, then I don't know New Mexico will have a great advantage over the others by being one of those states that has come to that realization.
Well, about a month from now, once the session's over, what do you think will be maybe the top 2 or top 3 things that will be in the budget that will have come through, and that will be those top things that you will be working on the Judiciary Committee?
I expect that one of the focuses for the coming budget session is going to be the funding of education, and that has been, frankly, the central issue in most of my years in the legislature. The funding of public education in New Mexico represents about 60% of our budget, and if you bring in higher education, it's probably pretty close to 2/3 when you bring in our colleges and universities. So the budget inevitably has to focus on what we're doing with education, whether we're spending our money in the best places, and whether there's enough money going into education. There are those who believe that we should be looking at some of our permanent fund resources, money that we've set aside from extractive industries in years past, and beginning to invest that in early childhood education and other things, again, to get New Mexico out from the very bottom of states. And I believe that that's critical. I think it's very hard for New Mexico to attract businesses and the high-tech industries and the vision that I see for New Mexico. It's hard to do that when there's a belief or an image that our schools are among the lowest scoring, our students are among the lowest scoring in the country, and we have to put the investments into our education system to change that.
Yeah. Well, Senator Joseph Cervantes, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Sloan. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.